When I visited the amazing site of Karahan Tepe in Turkey about a year ago, the thing that amazed me most was a room that must have been a large Neolithic kitchen with two large ovens. The most impressive things about this room were the stacks of stone bowls and platters. Many of the people who viewed my video on the site also remarked on these stone vessels in their comments, and I promised I'd get out a video on the topic of Neolithic stone vessels. It's taken me quite a long while to get around to this, but finally it's done. While Karahan Tepe may be particularly favored with stone vessels, they actually occur at a lot of pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the Near East, and even at earlier sites belonging to Epipaleolithic hunter-gatherers of around 12,000 BCE. And they're often beautifully crafted and sometimes nicely decorated with incised motifs. Many of my viewers have asked how these early people were able to make them, or how long it took, and a few expressed doubt that this technology could have been within the capabilities of Epipaleolithic and Neolithic people. So, let's take a dive into this topic and see what these artifacts are like and how they may have been made. Stone vessels developed out of earlier artifacts that were used for grinding and pounding things like nuts, starting in the Upper Paleolithic more than 22,000 years ago. Sometimes these were just cup-like depressions in a flat outcrop of bedrock, but soon they also included large portable mortars and pestles, the mortars looking rather like thick bowls. Such equipment became widespread in the Epipaleolithic, especially from about 17,000 to 12,000 years ago, as in these examples from Israel, and soon included thin-walled bowls alongside the heavy mortars. While some of these bowls were plain, others were highly decorated with incised designs, as in this fragment of a bowl from the site of Wadi Hama 27 in northwestern Jordan. By the early Neolithic, in some parts of the Near East, but especially in what is now modern Turkey, stone vessels, often with rich decoration, were fairly widespread. Here you see some examples from the pre-pottery Neolithic site of Analogies Tepe in eastern Turkey. And here is a nicely decorated deep bowl from a site in southern Turkey called Analogies. Excavations at the more famous site of Göbekli Tepe have yielded thousands of grinding stones, including mortars, as well as heavy stone troughs. But they've also included fragments of fine stone bowls and other vessels. But the more spectacular case, as I mentioned in the introduction, is Karahan Tepe. It's not clear to me why so many stone vessels have been found at this site, or why so many of them are in great condition. But one possibility is that, for whatever reason, they were intentionally left in place as part of a ritual closing of the rooms in which they were found. Alternatively, maybe some disaster caused people to evacuate the site very suddenly, so that they left all these dishes behind. But I have yet to hear of any evidence for that. Whatever the reason, there are a great many of these vessels, including broad stone platters that may have been used for serving food, as well as deep stone bowls that were likely for cooking as well as for serving. Not all of them are decorated, indicating that they were probably for regular use, and not just for serving at special occasions like feasts. A lot of people find it hard to believe that early Neolithic people were capable of making these thin-walled, very impressive vessels. So, how were they made? One thing to mention is their raw materials. Already in the Epipaleolithic, people were making mortars and other grinding equipment not just from relatively soft limestone, but also from hard materials like basalt. These thin Neolithic bowls are often made of a stone called greenstone in the literature. But that term's not very precise, as it applies to a lot of minerals. In this case, the material could be chlorite, nephrite, olivine, or peridotite. Most of these are somewhat hard, 6 to 7 on the Mohs scale, but chlorite is very soft, only 2 to 2.5 on the Mohs scale. That makes it very easy to carve, and most of these amazing vessels from Karahan Tepe appear to be made of black or green chlorite. A few instead appear to be made of harder sorts of limestone, such as dolomite, which is 3.5 to 4 on the Mohs scale. But how do you make these? Archaeologists know a lot more about the manufacture of later stone vessels, such as those of Pharaonic Egypt. Egyptians also began to make stone vessels in the Neolithic, but the practice became particularly notable during the Nagata period through early Old Kingdom. From that time on, vessels made of alabaster, diorite, and other stones were ubiquitous in ancient Egypt, although becoming less popular over time as vessels of glass, faience, and other materials partially replaced them. We are fortunate that the Egyptians left us art that depicts how these stone vessels were made. Most likely, both Egyptians and their Neolithic predecessors roughed out the outer shape of the vessel by flaking and hammering. This took advantage of their extensive experience with flint knapping. They could also use pounding with hammer stones to remove smaller amounts of material. Especially for the large platters, they may first have marked off a circular outline with a sharp stone tool, using a string as a radius. This modern stone dresser is using a tungsten steel chisel, which may accomplish this far more quickly, but the main difference is that they don't break or wear out. Probably Neolithic stone dressers would have used hammer stones, the same way they reduced flint cores. Or perhaps they used flint axes or chisels that would have worked fairly well, but they broke or wore out a lot more often than steel ones, requiring the craftsperson to change or resharpen them. Rather than using a small chunk of flint, as in this modern reenactment, they could have used tools more like these ones, although these ones happen to be from the southern Levant. Egyptian craftsmen hollowed out the roughed out blocks of stone by drilling deep holes with copper tubular drills and using wet sand as an abrasive. The drills they used for this appear to be crank operated, even though we know they did use bow drills for drilling holes in wood, as in this view of a furniture maker. They then snapped off the ridges of stone between the drill holes, and later they probably used a much wider stone drill bit to widen the interior opening and make it rounder and smoother. Note here how the craftsman has attached weights to the drill to make it easier to press the drill down into the stone. To fine-tune the exterior, Egyptians probably used rotary grinding, somewhat the way modern carpenters turn wood on a lathe. Modern craftspeople who make replica stone vessels for the tourist trade have preserved or revived some of these traditions. Here you see an experimental archaeologist using this technique. However, it seems unlikely that early Neolithic people used any lathe-like tool to shape their vessels, so long before the invention of the potter's wheel, and they certainly didn't have copper tubes. They could still have drilled out the interiors with bow drills, perhaps using capstones like this one to hold the upper end of the drill shaft. The bowstring is wrapped around the shaft, and moving the bow back and forth rotates the shaft, and the shaft moves wet sand. This will sound strange to a lot of you, but it actually works, whether or not you bother to tip the shaft with the stone bit. In fact, one of the better methods is to use a hollow reed as a shaft, so that you don't have to remove all of the stone material, only a circle, as the Egyptians did with the copper tubes. It's not the wooden shaft or stone bit that does the cutting. Its only purpose is to move the sand around in a rotary fashion. The quartz sand does the cutting, and it can cut even rather hard materials because quartz has a Mohs hardness of 7. Alternatively, they could have hollowed out the roughouts by a combination of incising and chipping grooves into the stone and then snapping off the stone between the grooves with wedges or stone chisels. Once the vessels were getting close to their finished shape, their makers could test them for roundness by rolling them slowly on a surface to see if they could detect a wobble, and then pound some more in areas that seemed to be too high until they eventually achieved a fairly circular shape. The final steps were to smooth the surfaces with grinding stones and wet sand, and for many of them, to incise designs on them with sharp flint tools. It's notable that in Southwest Asia, this practice of making beautiful stone vessels peaked in the early Neolithic and mostly faded out once pottery became ubiquitous. Stone vessels were occasionally made in later periods, including even obsidian bowls and alabaster jars in the pottery Neolithic. But in those later times, they seem to have been high prestige items. They were no longer everyday housewares. Presumably, that's because making a stone vessel requires many hours of labor, while by comparison, pottery could be mass-produced, even before the invention of the potter's wheel. However, post-Neolithic people continued the technology while focusing it almost exclusively on production of more practical grinding and pounding equipment like mortars. Now, we can only admire the ingenuity, patience, and skill of the craftspeople who produced these impressive and beautiful artifacts. Thank you for listening, and stay safe.